Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something I know a lot of you have been requesting: timeless strategic thinking. And what better way to get into that than with Sun Tzu's The Art of War?
It's a classic for a reason, right?
Absolutely. We've gone through and pulled out some really key excerpts, ones that hit on all different parts of warfare and leadership. But our mission here is to go beyond just the battlefield. We want to extract the core insights that apply to strategy in any situation, really.
Exactly. We're talking about leading people effectively, getting why it's so important to understand what conflict actually costs, that often overlooked power of deception, the need to adapt and use your resources wisely, timing is everything, and of course the absolute necessity of solid intelligence. All these timeless principles we can learn from.
So, are you ready to dive into the art of war?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with the whole art of command. One of the first things that jumped out at me is how much Sun Tzu stresses knowing your people. And I don't just mean names and ranks. He's talking about knowing each officer's talents, putting the right people in the right roles. So how does that level of detail translate into a real strategic advantage?
Well, think of it like a sports team. To win, you need to know your players, right? Their strengths, their weaknesses, where they perform best. Same idea here. But it's more than just efficient deployment. Sun says really getting at this idea of a resilient, adaptable force. And that extends to their well-being, too. He's big on keeping your command safe because their condition, their morale, it's all fundamental to success.
And then there's this whole idea of clear orders and accountability. The text is pretty blunt. Unclear instructions, that's on the general. But clear orders disobeyed, well, that's on the officers. And to really drive this point home, we have that pretty dramatic example of King Wu's concubines. Can you walk us through that one? What's the leadership lesson there?
Oh, absolutely. So King Wu wants to test Sun Tzu's skills, right? So he hands him this group of concubines and says, train him as soldiers. Now, the concubines don't take the drill seriously at all, but the instructions were clear.
So whose fault is it?
Exactly. So Sun Tzu, remembering he's accepted this commission, follows the rules, orders the execution of the company leaders. Problem is, those leaders happen to be the king's favorites.
Oops.
All right. The king sends a message, stop the execution. But Sun Tzu's response is key here. He basically says, look, I accepted this duty, I have to carry it out. And this highlights a really vital point about leadership. It's about upholding standards, even when you've got pressure from the very top. It shows that commands without the will to enforce them, well, they're just words.
It's a powerful reminder of how seriously leadership needs to be taken, and that consistency is key. Now, the text also includes this really interesting historical preface by Wei Wuti, and it gives some context on how warfare was viewed in ancient China. It wasn't just about random violence, right?
No, not at all. Cao brings in all these fundamental texts, the Lun Yu, Shu Qing, I Ching, Shi Qing. He's showing that military strength, historically, it was a tool for order, even justice. Using force, obviously a grave matter, but it had its place in governance, in survival.
And it wasn't just about warmongering either. You have the principle of the sage, which prioritizes peace. Force is a last resort.
Right, it's about balance.
Yeah.
And the preface actually warns against relying too much on one extreme or the other. He brings up Fu Chai and Yan Wang as examples.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with those figures, what's the takeaway from their stories?
Well, both of those rulers, they basically messed up by leaning too hard on one side. Fu Chai, overly confident in his military, ignores diplomacy. Ends badly. Yan Wang goes the total opposite direction. Too focused on peace, doesn't prepare for defense. Disaster.
So it sounds like a pretty strong argument for a balanced approach.
Exactly. You need both. Peaceful measures and the ability to use force when it's truly necessary.
Makes sense. The preface also gives a justification for having military weapons at all.
Right, because it's not just about destruction.
No.
It's presenting them as tools for wise leadership, to punish those who use violence, to restore peace in times of trouble, to overcome difficulties, to protect the vulnerable. It's a perspective that frames military power as a necessary evil, maybe, but ultimately for safeguarding stability and the vulnerable.
Right. And then it touches on human nature a bit, saying that fighting back when attacked is almost instinctual, driven by those basic emotions. It's saying that conflict in some form is just part of the human experience, isn't it?
Yeah, it's saying those emotions, love, hatred, joy, anger, they can lead to conflict when provoked. And then it goes on to critique those scholars who just denounce any kind of military force whatsoever. The point is, ignoring its necessity can actually lead to weakness, invite aggression. It uses this interesting analogy of the teacher's rod and state punishments.
Oh, I remember that. So what's the underlying point of that comparison?
It's saying that a teacher uses a rod for correction. The state uses punishment to maintain order. In the same way, sometimes a ruler needs to use force, not all the time, but as a tool to correct injustice, prevent chaos.
So it's not advocating for constant war, but recognizing that it has its place.
Right. And then you have Tu Mu's perspective, which reinforces this. He sees war as a form of punishment, part of how a government functions, just like legal penalties. His ultimate goal, as he says, is to get rid of wicked people, bring safety and comfort to the good people. Stark view, but it reflects how they understood the role of power back then.
Okay, so we've got this broader historical context now. Let's shift gears and talk about some core strategic principles. One that's laid out early on is the idea of 5 constant factors that you need to assess before going into any conflict. What are those 5 factors, and why are they so crucial?
Okay, so those 5 factors are the moral lie. This basically means how united the ruler and the people are, their sense of purpose. Then there's the ability of the general, so their skills, leadership qualities. Next, you have the advantages of heaven and earth. This means the environment, the terrain, all those external factors. Then there's discipline, how organized, how obedient the army is. And finally, the system of rewards and punishments, how you motivate and control your troops. Sun Tzu presents these as the fundamentals that any leader needs to evaluate before engaging in conflict. They're the basis for forecasting the likely outcome. By assessing these 5 factors on both your side and the enemy's side, you can get a pretty good sense of who's likely to come out on top.
So it's way more than just counting soldiers or weapons. It's a really holistic view. And it's not enough to just identify those factors. You have to actually act on that assessment, right? Sun Tzu is also big on taking advice that's aligned with these principles.
Yeah, he says you need to heed advice that takes those 5 factors into account. And any advice that ignores them, dismiss it. Surround yourself with people who get those fundamental elements that determine success or failure. It applies to anything, really.
Which leads us to, I think, one of the cornerstones of Sun Tzu's thinking: deception. He states flat out that all warfare is based on deception. It's a theme that runs through the entire work.
It really is. The core idea is to create this mismatch between what the enemy thinks is going on and what's actually happening. Appearing weak when you're strong, inactive when you're about to move, far when you're near, near when you're far.
It's all about playing with their perceptions.
Exactly. So why do you think that kind of psychological manipulation is so effective?
Well, it seems like it's about messing with their decision-making process. If they misread your intentions, your capabilities, they're going to make bad choices, right? They're going to leave themselves open to attack. It's like a magician misdirecting the audience's attention.
Perfect analogy. And Sun Tzu even talks about using baits, luring the enemy into traps, feigning disorder so they think you're vulnerable, then you hit them with your real strength. It's about proactively shaping the battlefield, even before the actual fighting starts.
Okay, now this leads us to something that I think is often underestimated about warfare, and Sun Tzu doesn't shy away from it: the cost.
Yeah.
The financial burden of building and maintaining an army. He gives that example: 100,000 men costing 1,000 ounces of silver per day. That's huge.
Oh, yeah.
So what's the deeper point he's making by focusing on the economics of war?
He's hitting on this core principle. Victory isn't just about winning battles, it's about sustainability. Preserving your resources, keeping your society stable. A war that drags on, even if you win in the end, can cripple you. Sun Tzu points this out: dull weapons, low morale, exhausted troops, empty treasury.
Yeah, all those things add up.
They create vulnerabilities that your rivals can exploit. He says flat out, there's no example of a country truly benefiting from a long war. And the key to avoiding that, it's understanding the inherent evils of war so you can appreciate the value of speed, finishing things quickly.
So efficiency, speed, they're not just tactical preferences, they're economic necessities in warfare. And the text talks about avoiding second levies, being smart with supply lines, even foraging on the enemy. Why is foraging on the enemy so important strategically?
It does 2 really important things. First, it lightens that huge logistical burden of keeping a large army supplied, especially over long distances, reduces your costs, reduces your reliance on those long, vulnerable supply lines. And second, it deprives the enemy of their resources, weakens their ability to keep fighting. It's turning their own land against them.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And he really drives home the point about how much financial strain prolonged campaigns put on everyone: the state, the people. It's not just about military losses. Then, to keep the troops motivated, Sun Tzu talks about rewarding those who capture spoils. He even gives instructions on handling captured soldiers and resources. What's the thinking there?
It's turning a potential loss into a gain and motivating your troops. By rewarding them for capturing spoils, you encourage them to be aggressive, show them there's a tangible benefit to fighting well. But more importantly, you take those captured enemy units, those resources, and you integrate them into your own forces. It's like hitting two birds with one stone, replenishing your losses and weakening the enemy at the same time. You're basically fueling your war machine with their assets. And he points out capturing intact units, intact territories, much more valuable than just destroying everything.
And he also talks about the dangers of those long sieges. It sounds like he was really wary of getting bogged down in those drawn-out engagements. What are the big risks he points out?
Sieges take time, they require huge amounts of preparation, and all that drains your own resources while giving the enemy time to get stronger. And then there's the psychological factor. A general who gets impatient with a siege might launch a premature attack. Wasteful, costly. The takeaway is that quick, decisive action is almost always better than a long, drawn-out fight that just drains you.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about leadership's role in avoiding misfortune. Sun Tzu gives 3 ways a ruler can actually bring disaster on their own army. The first is giving commands without knowing if the army can even carry them out. What does he mean by that? How does that hobble the army?
Basically, he's saying you're setting them up to fail. If you order an advance but your troops aren't trained or equipped for it, or a retreat that's faster than they can manage, it just creates chaos, confusion, and ultimately defeat. It's like trying to force a car to go faster than its engine allows. You're just going to break something.
Okay. The second way is governing the army like it's a kingdom. So what's the key difference there that makes this a problem?
A kingdom, it's all about long-term stability, set hierarchies, and things move slowly, right? Lots of bureaucracy. But an army in the field needs to be agile. Decisions need to be made fast. The discipline and motivation are different. You can't run an army like a bureaucracy. It stifles initiative, creates confusion. You can't respond quickly to threats or opportunities. And as Sun Tzu says, it makes the soldiers restless. They need clear, direct leadership, especially in a crisis.
And the third way is not utilizing those talented officers.
Right. It emphasizes that you need to trust your commanders, empower them. If you micromanage, if you don't delegate, you're not just wasting talent, you're slowing everything down. It can really hurt morale, too. Recognizing the expertise of your commanders, trusting their judgment, that's essential for effective military leadership.
And then he pivots to this idea of winning before the battle's even begun. Through careful planning and calculation, it's these 5 stages he lays out: measurement, estimation, calculation, balancing of chances, then finally, victory. It's like taking pregame analysis to the extreme.
It is, and it emphasizes that systematic, analytical approach to strategy. Meticulously assessing the terrain, the enemy's strength, calculating your logistics, weighing your chances of success. It's all about stacking the deck in your favor. And he compares a victorious, disciplined army to a routed one a pound versus a single grain. It illustrates how powerful, thorough preparation can be.
And that overwhelming force, he compares it to pent-up waters bursting forth. It's such a vivid image, this unstoppable momentum. All right, let's talk about energy and tempo in warfare. Sun Tzu draws this interesting parallel between managing a large army and a small one.
Right.
It all comes down to division and organization.
Exactly. You break that large force down into smaller, well-defined units, clear lines of command. It's essential for maintaining control, being able to maneuver effectively.
Kind of like managing a big project. You got to break it down into smaller tasks, delegate effectively.
Yeah, great analogy. And then he uses those analogies of simple elements like musical notes, colors. It's about how a limited number of basic things can be combined in endless ways, all these different strategic approaches.
It's about creativity within a framework.
Exactly.
And the whole interplay of direct and indirect attacks is key here, too. It's not just about charging in head on. You got to be able to maneuver, strike unexpectedly. He says the army's attack should be like a torrent.
Right, and the quality of decision-making, particularly the timing, that's compared to a falcon swoop, swift, precise. It's about choosing the exact right moment to strike for maximum impact. He even uses that crossbow analogy that drawing back is the energy. Releasing the trigger is the decision. It's about building potential and then executing at the perfect time.
It's all about the build-up and the release. Now that takes us to exploiting weak points, being prepared. Sun Tzu says, attack where they don't defend, defend where they don't attack. It's classic, finding and exploiting those vulnerabilities while protecting your own.
Yeah, he really elevates subtlety and secrecy to this art form, become invisible, inaudible, and you control their fate. It's about probing for those undefended areas, forcing them to spread their forces thin, creating weaknesses all across their front.
It's about forcing them to react to you. He makes this point that being prepared for every possible attack can actually make you weaker. True strength comes from making the enemy react to your moves.
It's about controlling the narrative, setting the terms of engagement, and knowing when and where the battle will be fought. That lets you concentrate your forces at the decisive point, even if you're outnumbered overall. And he reminds us that warfare is fluid, constantly changing, just like the natural world. Adapting to the enemy, to the circumstances, that's the mark of a truly great leader. He calls them heaven-born captains.
So let's get into the nuts and bolts of maneuvering for that tactical advantage. Sun Tzu emphasizes that first, a general receives their orders from the sovereign, then their focus shifts to integrating their forces and making them a cohesive unit before they even set up camp.
It's about internal alignment, getting everyone on the same page. And he says the challenge of tactical maneuvering is taking something indirect, making it direct, turning disadvantage into advantage. It's about using deception to make your movements unpredictable, surprising. A great example of this is Hannibal and Napoleon crossing the Alps, appearing to go one way, then swiftly moving to outflank the enemy.
Though, obviously, those examples aren't in the original text.
Of course, but it illustrates the principle perfectly.
He also points out that maneuvering a well-disciplined army, that's a good thing. But trying to do the same with an undisciplined force that's incredibly risky underscores how important training and cohesion really are.
Absolutely. And he talks about rushing to grab an advantage with a fully equipped army, which can actually lead to delays. On the other hand, sending a smaller, faster force can give you speed, but then you're sacrificing supplies and equipment. There are always trade-offs. And he points out the dangers of those forced marches, fatigue, potential losses. It's about balance. And then he stresses securing those supply lines, having those bases. An army cut off from its resources is in serious trouble.
Yeah, logistics are everything. He also goes into how the terrain factors into all this. Where to set up camp, linking up with allies, avoiding isolated positions. It's about using the environment to your advantage, denying it to the enemy.
And then there's using the enemy situation to your advantage, creating distractions, keeping them busy, making false promises to lure them into bad spots. It's all about disrupting their plans, creating opportunities for yourself.
Disrupting, distracting. It's all psychological warfare.
Right.
Okay, so towards the end of this section, Sun Tzu outlines those 5 fatal flaws that a general can have. Recklessness, timidity, a quick temper, too concerned with reputation, and being overly focused on the well-being of the troops to the point where it hinders necessary actions. It's a really fascinating look at the psychology of leadership under pressure.
It is. Now, when an army's on the move, he gives very practical advice on observing signs.
Like reading the environment.
Exactly. Things like choosing good spots to encamp near valleys when you're crossing mountains, high ground and dry areas, avoiding bad terrain marshes, confined places.
And then there's interpreting what the enemy's doing.
Right, how the birds are flying, how animals react, the kinds of dust clouds you see. They can all tell you about potential ambushes, attacks, even the size and makeup of the enemy forces. It's about reading the landscape, but it's constantly changing.
It's like a living, breathing intelligence report.
That's a good way to put it. And even little details in how they're acting can tell you a lot. Humble words but increased preparations could mean they're about to advance. Aggressive talk, forward movements, that could mean they're actually retreating. The placement of their chariots, what their peace proposals are like, even how the soldiers themselves are behaving. Are they leaning on their spears? Are they drinking water excessively? All those things can tell you about their morale, their intentions, their physical state.
I remember there were even signs that pointed to a really desperate situation.
Right, things like feeding their horses grain, killing cattle, but not setting up cooking pots. That means they're ready to fight to the death, no plans to return. It's remarkable how much detail he goes into about observing human behavior under those extreme conditions.
It's incredible. Now, all of this leads us to what he calls the 9 situations.
Right.
These are basically 9 types of terrain and how you approach them strategically. So you have dispersive ground, facile ground, contentious ground, open ground, intersecting highways, serious ground, difficult ground, hemmed-in ground, and desperate ground.
That's a mouthful.
Each one requires a different mindset, different actions. Like on dispersive ground, your priority is unifying your forces. On facile ground, it's maintaining connections. And on desperate ground, well, you fight. You fight with everything you've got.
Right, it's adapt or die. And for each of those situations, he gives very specific tactical advice. It's about adapting to the environment and to the psychological impact it has on your troops. So, for example, the deeper you get into enemy territory, the more important it is to maintain that solidarity in your own ranks.
Keep everyone together, focused on the mission.
Exactly. Now, on desperate ground, there's no retreating. You're all in. He describes the soldiers in this situation as weeping, but still resolute, determined to fight to the very end. And he uses this analogy of the Shuaijian snake. If you hit one part of it, the whole thing reacts. It's that idea of a cohesive, responsive army where everyone moves as one.
And that level of unity takes work.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about setting a single standard of courage, leading as if you're only leading a single man, keeping things secret, maintaining order. He even suggests using false information, keeping your own officers and men in the dark about the real plan.
It's all about controlling the flow of information.
Right, need-to-know basis. And then he goes back and emphasizes, again, knowing the enemy's intentions, adapting your approach, but the ultimate goal, to move with speed and overwhelming force, like a thunderbolt.
Okay, let's move on to fire. Using fire as a tactical weapon.
Ooh, this is a good one.
Sun Tzu outlines 5 ways to launch fire attacks. Burning camps, stores, baggage trains, arsenals, even using those fire arrows.
Right, but he's careful to point out that just wanting to use fire isn't enough. You need the right circumstances. The weather has to be dry. You need the materials to get those fires going. He even suggests looking at celestial alignments, making sure the stars are in your favor. And he's not big on relying solely on traders inside the enemy camp to start those fires. You need other options.
So you have to be prepared to create those opportunities yourself.
Right. And once the fires are set, he lays out 5 different ways things can unfold and how you should respond. It's not just about lighting things up and hoping for the best. You have to be strategic. So, say you set a fire inside their camp. You got to be ready to attack from the outside.
Coordinate your movements.
Exactly. And critically, always attack from the windward side. That way the fire's working for you, not against you. And he points out the difference between daytime and nighttime winds. These are details you have to pay attention to.
And he makes this interesting point about how fire can be a powerful tool for attack, but water is more suited for defense, for interception. But the overarching principle is always the same. Preserve your own forces. Seek peace whenever possible.
No, finally we get to spies.
This is one of my favorite parts.
It's so fascinating.
Sun Tzu starts by reminding us of the enormous costs of war and says that it's foolish, even inhumane, to neglect gathering intelligence just because you don't want to spend a little.
Right, because foreknowledge, knowing what's coming, it's essential for good leadership, for making good decisions. But then he says you can't rely on supernatural signs or just past experience or even just your own calculations. You need human intelligence. You need spies.
For me, breaks down 5 different types.
Yeah. Local spies, those are inhabitants of the area. Inward spies, those are officials within the enemy ranks. Converted spies, those are enemy spies that you've turned to your side. Doomed spies, those are the ones you send to spread misinformation. And surviving spies, those are the ones who come back with intelligence.
It's a whole network, a system.
It's amazing how sophisticated it was for the time.
And he talks about building those relationships with your spies, treating them well, rewarding them, keeping everything top secret. If you betray your spy, there are serious consequences.
Right, trust is paramount.
And he talks about understanding the inner workings of the enemy camp, even down to who the attendants are, who the aides de camp are.
Yeah, every detail matters. He also talks about how to recruit those converted spies, offering them something, appealing to their self-interest, finding the corrupt officials you can turn.
Playing on those weaknesses.
Exactly. And then, of course, you can use those converted spies to spread your own misinformation.
Hubble agents.
Classic tactic. And he says that ultimately, converted spies, they're your most valuable source of information about the enemy. He even gives historical examples of how spies were used effectively in ancient China. His point is, the best leaders, the wisest generals, they prioritize intelligence gathering, and that's how they get amazing results. But he also warns that if you don't handle your spies carefully, it can lead to total disaster.
So there you have it. We've covered so much ground today. From the principles of leadership and the cost of warfare to the power of deception, timing, adaptability, and the absolute necessity of good intelligence.
So much wisdom packed into this one text.
Now, for our listeners, keep this in mind. Even though these insights come from ancient warfare, those core principles apply to strategy in any competitive environment. Think about business negotiations, leading a team, even making tough personal decisions. That focus on knowing your resources, knowing your opponent, understanding the landscape you're operating in. Those are timeless lessons. It's all about gaining knowledge quickly, but thoroughly.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And as you go about your week, think about this. Sun Tzu talks a lot about knowing your enemy in a military context. But how does that idea apply to your world? How do you understand the motivations, the strategies of your competitors, even your collaborators? And how do you gather that essential intelligence? It's a question worth pondering because this ancient text offers a wealth of knowledge that's still relevant today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time.